The crack of the storm echoed across the Wyoming plains as Quentin Vance peered out the window of his weathered ranch house. The year was 1874, and the solitude of his existence stretched before him like the endless prairie beyond his property line. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of isolation that defined his life at Fallen Oak Ranch, just outside Medicine Bow. The thunderstorm raging tonight was fitting company for a man who hadn't shared more than passing words with another soul in nearly 3 weeks. Lightning illuminated the yard, revealing rain-soaked fence posts and the silhouettes of his horses huddled in the distant stable. Quentin sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. The life of a cattle rancher wasn't meant to be lived alone, but circumstances had a way of deciding a man's path. After losing his parents to influenza 6 years prior, the burden of maintaining the family ranch had fallen squarely on his shoulders. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, driving Quentin to check his supplies. The cellar door creaked as he pulled it open, grabbing a lantern from the hook on the wall. The stone steps leading down were worn smooth from decades of use, a testament to the ranch's history stretching back to when his grandfather had first staked a claim in Wyoming territory. The beam of light swung across the shelves of preserved food and supplies when a sudden movement caught his eye. There, crouched behind a barrel of salted meat, was a woman. Quentin froze, the lantern held high. She was curled into herself, arms wrapped protectively around her knees, eyes wide with terror. Her dress was torn and mudded, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around a face both beautiful and desperate. A fresh bruise marked her left cheek and her lip was split. "Who in God's name are you?" Quentin demanded, shock making his voice harsher than intended. The woman flinched, pressing herself further against the wall. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm raging above. "Please don't send me back." Quentin lowered the lantern slightly, taking in the fear etched across her features. Those 5 words hung in the damp air between them, laden with unspoken horrors. "Back where? Who are you running from?" he asked, his tone softening despite his wariness. She swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the cellar steps as though expecting pursuit. "My name is Josephine Jensen, my husband." Her voice broke on the word, hands trembling. "He'll kill me if he finds me." Quentin's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough stories about men who treated their wives like property to know what she wasn't saying. The bruises told their own story. "How did you get here?" he asked, keeping his distance. Medicine Bow wasn't large, but he didn't recall anyone named Jensen. "I traveled with a freight wagon from Casper," she explained. "The driver let me off at the crossroads. I've been walking since yesterday, looking for somewhere to hide." Her eyes darted to the storm cellar door. "I'm sorry for trespassing. Your barn was locked, but the cellar wasn't. I just needed shelter for the night." The thunder crashed overhead, making them both glance upward. Quentin studied her face, looking for deception but finding only exhaustion and fear. He'd lived by his wits long enough to trust his instincts, and something about her desperation rang true. "You can't stay down here," he said finally. "Come upstairs, I'll make some coffee." Relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by uncertainty. "Are you alone here?" Quentin nodded. "Just me and about 60 head of cattle. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles east." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were cold and trembling as he helped her to her feet. In the lantern light, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with intelligent green eyes that seemed to evaluate every shadow. Upstairs in the kitchen, Quentin stoked the fire in the cast iron stove while Josephine sat rigidly at the table, her eyes constantly moving to the windows whenever the lightning flashed. "He won't find you here tonight," Quentin said, setting a steaming cup before her. Not in this storm. Her hands wrapped around the mug, seeking warmth. You don't know him. Francis doesn't give up easily. This Francis, he from Casper, she nodded. He owns the largest mercantile there. Everyone respects him. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. No one would believe what he does behind closed doors. Quentin pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I've got no love for men who raise their hands to women, he said quietly. You can stay the night. Tomorrow we'll figure something out. Relief softened her features. Thank you, Mr. Vance, Quentin Vance. Thank you, Mr. Vance. I won't trouble you longer than necessary, Quentin shrugged. Where do you plan to go? Her gaze dropped to the table. I have a cousin in Denver. If I can reach her, I might be safe. Denver's a long way, he observed. Anywhere is better than going back to him. They fell silent as the storm continued its assault on the ranch house. Quentin offered her bread and some cold venison from his dinner. She ate carefully, like someone accustomed to rationing. The spare room isn't much, Quentin said after she'd finished eating, but it's dry and warm. I can sleep here by the fire, she insisted. I don't want to impose further. It's no imposition. Been empty since my mother passed. He showed her to a small room off the main hallway. It was plain but clean, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. A quilt his mother had made lay folded at the foot of the bed. Thank you, Josephine said, lingering in the doorway. Most men wouldn't help a strange woman who broke into their cellar. I'm not most men, Quentin replied simply. And you didn't break in, just trespassed a little. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Good night, Mr. Vance. Good night, Mrs. Jensen. Sleep came reluctantly to Quentin that night. The presence of another person in his home, a woman in trouble, no less stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He lay awake listening to the storm gradually subside, wondering what the morning would bring. Dawn broke clear and bright, as if the violence of the previous night had never occurred. Quentin rose early, as was his habit, and was surprised to find Josephine already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove. Hope you don't mind, she said, her hair now neatly braided. Seemed the least I could do. Not at all. He poured himself a cup, noting how different she looked in daylight. Despite the bruises, there was a quiet strength in her bearing. You sleep all right, better than I have in months, she admitted. It's strange not to be afraid of what morning might bring. The simple statement hung heavy between them. Quentin cleared his throat. Got chores to tend to. You're welcome to stay inside. Actually, she said hesitantly, I'd rather help. I'm good with horses and I know my way around a ranch. My father raised quarter horses before he died. Quentin regarded her with newfound interest. That's so, she nodded. Francis forbade me from riding after we married, said it wasn't ladylike. Nothing unladylike about knowing horses, Quentin replied. Come on, then. Together they walked to the barn where 6 horses occupied the stalls. Josephine moved among them with confidence, murmuring softly and earning nickered greetings in response. You've got a beautiful Appaloosa, she commented, stroking the spotted stallion's neck. Thunderhead, Quentin said, raised him from a colt. The morning passed in companionable work. Josephine proved as capable as she'd claimed, mucking out stalls and helping Quentin repair a section of fence damaged in the storm. She worked without complaint, though he noticed her wince occasionally when she stretched too far. By midday, they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Over a lunch of cornbread and beans, Quentin found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about his family's history in Wyoming territory and the challenges of running the ranch alone. Why haven't you hired help? She asked. Quentin shrugged. Trust doesn't come easy to me. Had a hand steal 3 horses last year. Since then, I've managed on my own. It must be lonely. A man gets used to his own company. But even as he said it, Quentin realized how much he'd appreciated having someone to work alongside that morning. "What about you?" he asked. "How'd you end up with a man like Francis Jensen?" Josephine's expression darkened. "My father died when I was 19, left debts I didn't know about. Francis offered to settle everything if I'd marry him." She traced a pattern on the table with her finger. "He was charming at first. By the time I saw his true nature, it was too late." "No children?" Quentin asked. She shook her head. "Thank God for small mercies. Though he blamed me for that too." Her hand unconsciously moved to her ribs, suggesting injuries hidden beneath her dress. Anger flared in Quentin's chest. "A man like that doesn't deserve the name. In Casper, they call him a pillar of the community," she said bitterly. "Who would believe the word of a wife against such a respected businessman?" "I believe you," Quentin said simply. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared solitude. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Josephine tensed immediately, her face draining of color. "Stay inside," Quentin ordered, rising and grabbing his Winchester from above the fireplace. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. A single rider approached down the long drive, Sheriff Emerson from Medicine Bow. Quentin's shoulders relaxed slightly, though not entirely. The law was no guarantee of justice for a woman in Josephine's situation. "It's the sheriff," he told her, "probably just making his rounds." "Please," Josephine whispered, "don't tell him I'm here." Quentin hesitated, weighing his options. Harboring a runaway wife could mean trouble, but turning her over without hearing the full story sat wrong with him. "Stay in the back room. I'll handle this." She nodded gratefully and disappeared down the hallway as Quentin stepped onto the porch to greet the approaching lawman. Sheriff Emerson was a weathered man in his 50s, with a salt and pepper mustache and shrewd eyes that didn't miss much. He tipped his hat as he dismounted. "Morning, Vance. Storm treat you all right?" "Well enough. Lost a section of fence, but nothing serious." "What brings you out this way, making rounds?" "Storm washed out part of the creek road." The sheriff's gaze moved past Quentin to the house. "Also got word from Casper about a missing woman. Thought I'd ask if you'd seen anyone unusual." Quentin kept his expression neutral. "Been pretty quiet out here, just me and the livestock." Sheriff Emerson nodded slowly. "Husband says she's not right in the head, worried she might harm herself." "That's so." Quentin's tone was carefully measured. "Must be mighty concerned to send word all the way to Medicine Bow. Offering a $100 reward for information," the sheriff added, studying Quentin's reaction. "Says she took family heirlooms when she left." "Sounds serious," Quentin commented, leaning against the porch post. "What's she look like?" "Mid-20s, dark hair, green eyes. Name's Josephine Jensen." "I'll keep an eye out," Quentin promised. "Though not much reason for a lady from Casper to wander this far." The sheriff nodded. "True enough. Still, if you hear anything, you'll be the first to know." After a few more minutes of casual conversation, Sheriff Emerson mounted his horse and continued on his circuit of the outlying ranches. Quentin watched until he disappeared over the ridge before returning inside. He found Josephine standing in the kitchen, pale but composed. "He's looking for me." "Your husband's telling people you're unstable," Quentin confirmed. "Said you stole from him." She shook her head vehemently. "The only thing I took was my mother's locket." Her hand went to her throat where a small silver pendant hung. "Everything else I left behind." "I believe you," Quentin assured her, "but this complicates things. If he's offering a reward, folks will be watching for you." "I should leave," she said, though fear flickered in her eyes. "I've put you in danger already." "And go where?" "On foot. You wouldn't make it to the next town before someone spotted you." Josephine sank into a chair, the brief surge of determination fading. "I don't know what to do." Quentin was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he spoke. The sheriff will expect you to be moving south toward Denver. What if we let you disappear here instead? What do you mean? I need help with the ranch. You need a place to hide. Stay here at least until the search dies down. Josephine looked up at him, surprise evident on her face. You do that for a stranger. You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Quentin pointed out, and I've seen how you handle yourself around horses. Hope warred with caution in her expression. What if someone from town comes by? We'll say you're my cousin from back east, come to help after my injury. At her questioning look, he grinned. I'll bandage my arm. Give us both a reason to explain why you're doing most of the work. For the first time since her arrival, Josephine laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face. You're either very kind or very foolish, Mr. Vance. Quentin, he corrected. And probably both. Do we have an agreement? She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, thank you, Quentin. The plan was settled, and with it came a strange sense of rightness that Quentin hadn't expected. Having Josephine at the ranch didn't feel like harboring a fugitive, it felt like filling an absence he'd grown too accustomed to ignoring. The next 2 weeks established a routine that suited them both. Josephine proved invaluable around the ranch, her knowledge of horses complementing Quentin's cattle expertise. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, gradually learning each other's rhythms and preferences without needing to speak. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch watching the sun set over the distant mountains. Conversation came easier with each passing day as trust slowly built between them. Tell me about your family, Josephine asked one evening as they shelled peas for dinner. You mentioned your parents, but not much else. Quentin's hands continued their steady work. Not much to tell. My grandfather came out here in '42 before Wyoming was even a territory. Built this place from nothing. Pride colored his voice. My father expanded it, added the north pasture. Would have been my brother's inheritance too, but he died of scarlet fever when I was 14. I'm sorry, Josephine said softly. It must have been hard losing him. Changed everything. Father never quite recovered from it. Quentin paused. What about you? Any siblings? A sister, Eleanor. She married a banker and moved to San Francisco years ago. Josephine's expression turned wistful. We write occasionally, but Frances monitored my correspondence. I haven't told her what life was really like. Why not? Shame, I suppose, admitting I made such a terrible mistake. She set aside a handful of pea pods. And fear. Francis has connections everywhere. If I tried to flee to her, he would have found me. Quentin studied her profile in the fading light. The bruises had begun to heal, and proper food had brought a healthy glow back to her skin. More significant was the change in her demeanor. The constant fear was giving way to a quiet confidence. He won't find you here, Quentin said with quiet certainty. Josephine's eyes met his. I'm starting to believe that. Their growing companionship faced its first test the following Sunday when Quentin needed supplies from town. Normally, a simple errand, it now carried risk. Someone might mention the mysterious woman staying at Fallen Oak Ranch, or news of Josephine's disappearance might have spread further. I should go alone, Quentin insisted over breakfast. Less chance of questions. Josephine shook her head. If your injured cousin never shows her face in town, people will talk more, not less. We need to establish my presence openly. It's dangerous, he argued. So is hiding forever, she countered. Better to face it directly. Besides, my hair is different now. She'd cut it shorter and lightened it with lemon juice in the sun. Combined with the simple clothing she'd altered from Quentin's mother's old dresses, she looked markedly different from the frightened woman who'd arrived in the storm. Reluctantly, Quentin agreed. They rehearsed their story. She was Josephine Miller, his mother's sister's daughter from Ohio, come west after being widowed to help her injured cousin manage the ranch. The wagon ride to Medicine Bow was tense at first. Josephine sat rigidly beside Quentin, her hands clutching the seat. But as the landscape rolled by without incident, she gradually relaxed, even commenting on the beauty of the wildflowers dotting the prairie. Medicine Bow was typical of frontier towns, a main street lined with basic necessities. General store, blacksmith, saloon, small hotel, and church. Sunday morning meant most businesses were closed, but the general store stayed open after services for the benefit of ranchers who couldn't make it to town during the week. Quentin helped Josephine down from the wagon, conscious of the curious glances from townspeople emerging from the white steepled church. He'd bandaged his right arm in a sling, partly obscured by his coat enough to support their story without appearing overly dramatic. Quentin Vance, called Abigail Porter, the postmaster's wife, approaching with undisguised curiosity. "Haven't seen you in town for weeks, and who might this be?" "Mrs. Porter, may I introduce my cousin, Josephine Miller?" Quentin made the introduction smoothly. "Joe, this is Mrs. Porter, who knows everything that happens within 50 miles of here." Mrs. Porter preened at the description. "A pleasure to meet any family of Quentin's. Are you visiting long?" "I'm staying to help Quentin with the ranch," Josephine replied with a practiced smile. "At least until his arm heals properly." "Such a nasty fall from that new stallion," Quentin added, touching his bandaged arm. "Would have been lost without Joe's help." Mrs. Porter's eyes gleamed with fresh gossip. "Well, isn't that fortunate timing, and you're from?" "Ohio," Josephine supplied. "My husband passed last year. When I heard about Quentin's accident, it seemed the right time for a change of scenery." The mention of widowhood immediately softened Mrs. Porter's expression. "My condolences, my dear. How wonderful you found purpose here helping family." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before excusing themselves to complete their errands. Inside the general store, Quentin noticed Josephine's hands trembling slightly as she examined bolts of fabric. "You're doing fine," he murmured, standing close enough that only she could hear. "Mrs. Porter will spread the word faster than a telegraph." A small smile touched her lips. "Is she always so?" "Nosy. Yes, but useful in this case." They collected the supplies they needed: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, nails for repairs. The storekeeper, Mr. Hanson, was less interested in their personal business, though he did comment that Quentin seemed to be buying more supplies than usual. "2 mouths to feed now," Quentin explained easily. "And my cousin has a proper appreciation for good coffee, unlike the mud I've been drinking." The errand was nearly complete when the door opened, and Sheriff Emerson entered. Josephine tensed beside Quentin but maintained her composure as the lawman approached. "Vance," the sheriff nodded. "Heard you had company." His gaze moved to Josephine, assessing. "My cousin from Ohio," Quentin explained. "Josephine Miller, this is Sheriff Emerson." Josephine extended her hand with remarkable steadiness. "A pleasure, Sheriff. I've been hearing about Medicine Bow's fine law enforcement since I arrived." The sheriff shook her hand, his shrewd eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. "Welcome to Wyoming territory, Mrs. Miller. Sorry about your husband." "Thank you," she replied, the perfect picture of subdued grief. "It's been a difficult year, but helping Quentin has given me purpose again." Sheriff Emerson nodded slowly. "Always good to have family in times of trouble." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press further. After purchasing their supplies, Quentin and Josephine loaded the wagon and headed back to the ranch. Neither spoke until Medicine Bow was well behind them. "He suspects something," Josephine said finally, the tension releasing from her shoulders. Maybe, Quentin conceded. But suspicion isn't proof, and your performance was convincing. It felt strange, creating a whole new life so easily. Quentin glanced at her. Is that what this is? A new life? Josephine gazed at the open prairie stretching around them. I hope so. I can't go back to the old one. You won't have to, Quentin promised. The certainty in his voice surprised even him. The following weeks brought a deepening of their connection. Josephine flourished away from her husband's shadow, revealing a quick wit and practical intelligence that Quentin increasingly admired. She improved the organization of the ranch house, established a vegetable garden that promised fresh produce through summer, and demonstrated a natural affinity with the horses that surpassed even Quentin's expertise. For his part, Quentin found himself smiling more, talking more, planning for a future that suddenly seemed less solitary. They fell into an easy partnership that blurred the lines between their fabricated relationship and something genuine. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch steps watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air was fragrant with wildflowers and the distant scent of pine from the foothills. I never thanked you properly, Josephine said suddenly. For believing me that first night, Quentin shrugged. Wasn't hard to believe. Your face told the story clear enough. Still, you took a risk. You didn't know me. Sometimes you just know what's right, he replied simply. She turned to study his profile. Have you always lived by that principle? Tried to. Doesn't always work out. He hesitated, then added, My father used to say a man's character is what he does when no one's watching. Your father sounds wise. He was. Quentin picked up a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. Would have liked you, I think. Mother, too. Josephine smiled at that. I would have liked to meet them. They sat in comfortable silence as the last rays of sun disappeared and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Gradually, the evening chorus of crickets and nighthawks filled the air. I keep waiting, Josephine said softly, for something to go wrong, for him to find me. It's been over a month, Quentin reminded her. No word from town, no strangers asking questions. Even Mrs. Porter seems to have accepted our story. I know. Logically, I know that. But I lived with fear for so long. She wrapped her arms around herself. Sometimes I wake up and can't believe this is real. Without thinking, Quentin reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were warm and fit perfectly between his. It's real, Joe. The nickname slipped out naturally and she didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently. Thank you. They remained that way, hands entwined, until the evening chill drove them inside. Something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed without words or grand declarations. That night, for the first time, Quentin dreamed not of cattle prices or weather concerns, but of green eyes and the possibility of a shared future. July brought the hottest days of summer, the sun beating down mercilessly on the Wyoming plains. Work continued regardless of the heat. Cattle needed tending, hay needed cutting, the endless tasks of ranch life demanded attention. Quentin had long since abandoned his fake injury. Their story was established in town, and the sheriff hadn't asked further questions. Life settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly permanent. They were repairing the north fence one sweltering afternoon when Quentin broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. Have you thought about what comes next? He asked, hammering a nail into a fence post. Your plan was Denver originally. Josephine paused in handing him nails. Are you asking me to leave? No, he said quickly. The opposite, actually. She looked at him questioningly. Quentin set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow. I'm asking if you want to stay. Not as my cousin or my hired hand. As, he faltered, suddenly uncertain. As what? She prompted softly. As whatever you want to be, he finished. I just know I don't want to go back to the way things were before you came. Josephine's expression softened. Neither do I. Your husband is still legally my husband, she acknowledged. But with each passing day, he feels more like a nightmare I've awakened from. She moved closer to Quentin. I can't pretend I don't feel something growing between us. Nor can I, he admitted. But I won't ask you for something that can't be. What if it can be? Her eyes held a determination he'd come to recognize. Francis may never divorce me, but that doesn't mean I have to live as his wife. Not in any way that matters. Quentin studied her face, seeing the woman who had emerged from the shadow of fear, confident, capable, and increasingly dear to him. Are you saying you want to stay here with me? Yes, she said simply. If you'll have me. The distance between them vanished as Quentin pulled her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. I should warn you, Quentin said, his forehead resting against hers. I'm not good at temporary arrangements. Josephine smiled, her hand resting against his cheek. Neither am I. That evening marked the beginning of a new chapter. Though they maintained separate bedrooms for propriety's sake, their relationship deepened with each passing day. They were cautious in town, maintaining the cousin facade, but at the ranch, they allowed themselves the freedom to explore their growing feelings. August brought the cattle drive to Cheyenne, a necessary absence that neither welcomed. Quentin would be gone for nearly 2 weeks with the neighboring Martin Ranch hands, leaving Josephine alone at Fallen Oak. I could come with you, she suggested, as he prepared to depart. Quentin shook his head. Too risky. Cheyenne's bigger than Medicine Bow, more chance of someone recognizing you. I don't like the thought of you facing those trails alone. I won't be alone. The Martins are good men. He checked the cinch on Thunderhead's saddle. Besides, someone needs to mind the ranch. Josephine nodded, though concern still lined her face. Promise me you'll be careful, always am. He drew her close for a lingering kiss. I'll be back before you know it. The days of Quentin's absence stretched long for Josephine. She occupied herself with ranch work and preparations for the coming winter, but nights were the hardest. The house seemed too quiet, too empty without his presence. On the 10th day, she was in the barn grooming the horses when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Relief flooded through her. Quentin was back early. She rushed to the barn door, a welcoming smile on her face. The smile died as she recognized the rider. Francis Jensen sat astride a gleaming black stallion, his fine suit and polished boots incongruous against the rugged landscape. He was handsome in the conventional way that had once impressed her: well-groomed dark hair, strong jaw, the appearance of respectability that had masked his true nature. His cold blue eyes fixed on her with a mixture of triumph and fury. Hello, Josephine. You've led me on quite a chase. Fear clutched at her throat, but she forced herself to stand tall. How did you find me? Money talks, he replied smoothly, dismounting. And people notice a woman living alone with a man who isn't her husband, no matter what story you concoct. Quentin will be back soon, she warned. Though she knew it wasn't true, Francis laughed, the sound chilling in its familiarity. Your rancher is miles away with his cattle. The sheriff in town was quite informative about the drive to Cheyenne. He advanced toward her, and Josephine retreated into the barn. Her mind raced, calculating options. The house was too far to reach safely. The pitchfork leaned against a nearby stall, a potential weapon. You've embarrassed me, Josephine, Francis continued, his voice hardening. Left me to explain your disappearance to the entire town. Created scandalous rumors. I'm not going back with you, she stated firmly, his smile tightened. You have no choice. You're my wife. The law is on my side. The law doesn't permit you to beat me." "Your word against mine," he countered. "And who will believe a woman who abandoned her husband to live with another man?" He stepped closer. "I've been patient, Josephine. That patience has run out." She lunged for the pitchfork, but Francis was faster. He caught her arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. The familiar grip, the smell of his cologne, it all brought back the terror she'd lived with for years. "You've forgotten your place," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "I'll remind you on the journey home." "This is my home now," she gasped, struggling against his hold. "With your lover," Francis sneered. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? The whole territory is laughing behind their hands at Frances Jensen's runaway wife and her rancher." Josephine's blood ran cold. "How many people know you're here?" "No one that matters," he answered, tightening his grip. "I handled this personally. Your shame is between us." That knowledge gave her a flicker of hope. If no one knew Francis had found her, there was still a chance. She stopped struggling, letting her body go limp as though surrendering. Francis relaxed his hold slightly, satisfaction in his voice. "That's better. Now pack your things. We leave immediately." The moment his grip loosened, Josephine drove her elbow hard into his stomach. He doubled over with a grunt of pain and surprise, giving her the chance to break free. She ran, not toward the house but toward the corral where Maple, her favorite mare, was saddled from her morning ride. Francis recovered quickly, lunging after her with a roar of anger. "You'll regret that." Josephine reached the horse, swinging herself into the saddle with the skill that had once been her pride. Francis grabbed for the reins, but Maple danced sideways, evading his grasp. "You can't run forever," he shouted as she urged the mare toward the open gate. "I don't need forever," she called back. "Just long enough." She rode hard toward town, knowing Francis would follow. Her only hope was to reach Sheriff Emerson, not because she trusted him to protect her, but because a public confrontation would force Francis to maintain his respectable facade. The road to Medicine Bow stretched before her, dusty and exposed. Behind, she could hear the pounding hooves of Francis's stallion giving chase. His horse was larger, faster, and fresher than Maple, who had already been exercised that morning. The distance between them closed steadily. Josephine leaned low over the mare's neck, urging her to greater speed, but the inevitable was only delayed. Near the creek crossing, Francis drew alongside, reaching for her reins. Josephine swerved Maple sharply away, but the sudden movement on the uneven ground proved too much. The mare stumbled, throwing Josephine forward over her neck. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Dazed, she tried to rise as Francis dismounted and approached. His face was twisted with a rage she knew all too well. "You never learn," he growled, grabbing her arm and yanking her to her feet. "Let her go." The command came from behind them, firm and unwavering. Josephine turned to see Quentin sitting atop Thunderhead, his Winchester leveled at Francis. Relief crashed through her like a wave. "Quentin." Francis maintained his grip on her arm, positioning her slightly before him. "This doesn't concern you, rancher. She's my wife." "I'm making it my concern," Quentin replied, his voice steady despite the fury in his eyes. "Take your hands off her, now." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Francis released Josephine, raising his hands slightly. "There's no need for violence. We're simply having a marital disagreement." "Is that what you call the bruises she was wearing when she arrived at my ranch?" Quentin dismounted, keeping the rifle trained on Francis. "Or is that your idea of husbandly affection?" Francis's expression hardened. "You've been harboring my wife for months. The law won't look kindly on that." "The law also frowns on men who beat women," Quentin countered. "Joe, come here." Josephine moved swiftly to Quentin's side, her heart pounding. "How did you find us?" Finished the drive early, saw the dust from the ridge and recognized trouble. His eyes never left Frances. "You all right?" "Yes," she assured him, though her arm throbbed where Frances had gripped it. Francis adjusted his coat, recovering his composure. "This is absurd. I came to retrieve my lawful wife. You have no right to interfere." "She doesn't want to go with you," Quentin stated flatly. "Her wants are irrelevant. She's my wife under the law. A law that gives you no right to harm her." Frances's smile was cold. "Prove I have. It would be her word against mine, and I'm a respected businessman. She's a woman who abandoned her marriage vows to live with another man." The standoff stretched between them, the Wyoming sun beating down mercilessly. Josephine could see Quentin calculating, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. Frances was right, the law would likely side with him as her husband. "What if I bought her freedom?" Quentin asked finally. Frances blinked, thrown by the unexpected proposal. "Excuse me." "You're a businessman. Everything has a price." Quentin lowered the rifle slightly. "Name it." A slow, calculating smile spread across Frances's face. "You want to buy my wife, I want to buy her divorce," Quentin clarified. "Clean, legal, final. You return to Casper, we never cross paths again." Frances considered, avarice warring with wounded pride. $5,000. It was an enormous sum, nearly everything Quentin had saved over years of hard work. Josephine started to protest, but he silenced her with a gentle touch. $3,000, Quentin countered. "Paid when the divorce papers are signed." Frances's eyes narrowed. $4,000, half now, half when it's finalized." "Done." Quentin extended his hand. "We'll draw up terms in town with witnesses." Frances hesitated, then shook the offered hand. "You're overpaying, rancher. She's not worth half that." "That's where you're wrong," Quentin replied evenly. "She's worth everything." In Sheriff Emerson's office, an agreement was drafted with the town lawyer as witness. Frances would file for divorce citing abandonment, making no further claims on Josephine or attempt to contact her. In exchange, he would receive $4,000, an amount that would strain Quentin's resources to the breaking point, but one he paid without hesitation. As Frances prepared to depart Medicine Bow, he paused beside Josephine. "You think you've won," he murmured, too low for others to hear. "But you'll always be the woman who ran away, who lived in sin with a cattle rancher." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "Better that than being the woman who died under your hands." "Goodbye, Frances." The ride back to Fallen Oak was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Quentin had sacrificed nearly everything to secure her freedom. The enormity of his gesture left Josephine simultaneously grateful and guilty. "You shouldn't have done it," she said finally as the ranch came into view. "It's too much money." "It's only money," Quentin replied simply. "Can always earn more, but your savings, your plans for the ranch." He reined Thunderhead to a stop, turning to face her. "Joe, listen to me. I've spent my whole life building something I thought mattered, this ranch, this land. But these past months with you showed me what really matters." His expression softened. "I'd pay twice that amount to know you're free and safe." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to repay me, just—" He hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "Just stay, if that's what you want." Josephine reached across the space between their horses, taking his hand. "It's all I want." The journey to legal freedom took 6 months. Frances filed the divorce papers as promised, though he dragged the process out as long as possible. Throughout the fall and into winter, Quentin and Josephine continued building their life together at Fallen Oak. Word of their arrangement spread through Medicine Bow, causing a predictable stir of gossip. Some disapproved, but many, especially those who had witnessed Francis Jensen's cold demeanor during his brief visit, stood by them. Sheriff Emerson made a point of riding out to the ranch one crisp December afternoon. "Thought you should know," he said, warming his hands by the fire. "Got word the divorce was finalized yesterday. Official notice should arrive with next week's mail." Josephine's breath caught. "It's done, truly." The sheriff nodded. "Signed by the territorial judge himself. You're a free woman, Mrs. Jensen, or I suppose it's Miss Miller again now." That evening, as snow fell gently outside, Quentin knelt before Josephine by the fireplace. "I wanted to wait until it was official," he said, taking her hands in his, "until there could be no question or shadow hanging over us." "Quentin," she whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he continued, "but I know what I want, and it's you. A life with you here at Fallen Oak, children someday if you want them, growing old together." He drew a small wooden box from his pocket. Inside lay a simple gold band. "Will you marry me, Josephine?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married on New Year's Day, 1875, in the small white church in Medicine Bow. The ceremony was modest but joyful, attended by neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had come to respect their quiet determination. Sheriff Emerson served as witness, offering gruff congratulations and a handshake that conveyed more approval than his words. Even Mrs. Porter, who had initially clucked her tongue at the scandal, brought a wedding cake and heartfelt wishes. "Never seen Quentin smile so much," observed old Mr. Martin, whose cattle drive had inadvertently given Francis the opportunity to find Josephine. "Good to see Fallen Oak with a proper mistress again." As they exchanged vows, Quentin and Josephine shared a private smile, knowing how far they had come from that stormy night when a frightened woman had hidden in a root cellar, pleading not to be sent back. Spring brought renewal to the land and to Fallen Oak. The financial strain of Francis's payoff required careful management, but together they made the ranch not just survive but thrive. Josephine's knowledge of horses proved valuable as they began breeding quarter horses alongside the cattle operation. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, now a cherished ritual, Josephine took Quentin's hand and placed it gently over her stomach. "I was going to wait to be sure," she said, her eyes shining, "but I can't keep it to myself any longer. We're going to have a baby." Joy spread across Quentin's face as he pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Our baby. Our family," she corrected, leaning into his embrace. "The beginning of it, anyway." In November 1875, Samuel Quentin Vance was born, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. He was followed 2 years later by Elizabeth Rose, whose arrival coincided with the most profitable year Fallen Oak had ever seen. The ranch expanded, adding the neighboring property when the Wilsons decided to move east. With careful management and hard work, Quentin and Josephine rebuilt their savings and established Fallen Oak as one of the premier breeding operations in the territory. 10 years after that stormy night when Josephine had first appeared in Quentin's cellar, they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard with the newest addition to their family, 3-year-old twins Andrew and Margaret. "Do you ever think about how different life might have been?" Josephine asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "If I hadn't found your cellar that night," Quentin's arm tightened around her waist. "Sometimes. But then I look at all this," he gestured to their children, the prosperous ranch, the life they'd built, "and I know it couldn't have been any other way." Josephine turned her face up to his, the years having added character but diminished none of her beauty. "From the moment I said, 'Please don't send me back,' and you didn't, I think our path was set." "Best decision I ever made," Quentin said, lowering his lips to hers for a kiss that still held all the tenderness and passion of their first. Their story became something of a legend in medicine. Bo, the lonely rancher, and the woman he rescued, who together built one of the most respected families in Wyoming territory. When their children were old enough to understand, Quentin and Josephine shared their history openly, turning a tale that began in fear into one of courage and enduring love. In later years, long after Wyoming had achieved statehood, visitors to Medicine Bow would often hear about Fallen Oak Ranch and the Vance family who owned it. The story varied in details depending on who told it, but the heart remained the same. A woman seeking refuge, a man offering shelter, and the extraordinary life they built together from those simple, desperate words. Please don't send me back. And as for Francis Jensen, he never returned to Medicine Bow. Reports filtered back occasionally he had remarried, lost his business to gambling debts, moved further west. But for Quentin and Josephine, he faded into irrelevance, a shadow from the past that had no power over their future. Their love story, born in a storm and tested by fire, endured through decades of Wyoming winters and summer droughts, through joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. It was a testament not to perfect circumstances, but to two imperfect people who chose each other every day, building something beautiful from an unexpected beginning. In the end, that lonely cellar where their story began became a family, joked the place where the Vance dynasty started, with a frightened woman and a solitary rancher who discovered that the greatest treasure wasn't gold or cattle or land, but the family they created together on the Wyoming plains.